But when she'd tried to step inside, the doorman's arm shot out, stiff and cold. "Not today," he'd said flatly, scanning her faded thrift store dress and scuffed sneakers. "This store has a certain clientele," the words sliced deeper than any insult ever had. Shoppers glanced her way, some curious, others smirking, before walking past. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we are glad you are here. The summer heat clung to downtown Atlanta like a heavy curtain, thick and unrelenting. Shoppers bustled along Peachtree Street, their laughter mingling with the rhythmic hum of passing cars and the faint jazz drifting from a nearby cafe. Amid the swirl of designer bags and polished heels, a 17-year-old girl named Imani Carter stood frozen outside the glass doors of Maison Vert, the city's most exclusive luxury boutique. Her eyes were locked on a dress, deep crimson silk that floated like liquid fire on the mannequin inside. It wasn't just fabric to her, it was a possibility, a vision of a life in which she was seen, valued, respected. A life beyond the cracked sidewalks and whispered slurs of the neighborhood she grew up in. But when she tried to step inside, the doorman's arm shot out, stiff and cold. "Not today," he'd said flatly, scanning her faded thrift store dress and scuffed sneakers. "This store has a certain clientele," the words sliced deeper than any insult ever had. Shoppers glanced her way, some curious, others smirking, before walking past. Imani stood there, cheeks burning, eyes stinging, as the doorman turned his back and the door closed with a soft click. The world moved on. She stayed. Tears welled and spilled, uninvited and unstoppable. She wiped them with the back of her hand, hating herself for crying, hating them for making her feel small. All she had wanted was to try on a dress. Instead, she'd been reminded, brutally, publicly, of exactly where the world believed she belonged. But as she turned to leave, shoulders shaking, someone across the street was watching, and he would change everything. This was only the beginning. The Carter family's apartment sat on the top floor of a crumbling red brick building in southwest Atlanta. The kind where window frames warped in the summer heat and the hallway lights flickered like a dying pulse. It wasn't much, but to Imani, it was home. The walls were lined with her mother's gospel records, and the faint scent of collard greens and lemon cleaner always hung in the air. Life had been complex, but predictable. Her mother, Denise, worked double shifts as a nurse's aide at Grady Memorial. Her younger brother, Caleb, had a gift for turning any broken thing, from toy cars to busted radios, back into something that worked. Imani was the dreamer of the family, the one who stayed up late sketching dress designs in her worn notebook, copying patterns from fashion magazines she borrowed from the library, dreaming of one day seeing her creations on a runway. But dreams didn't pay bills. And in the Atlanta of the 1990s, a city booming with new money and old prejudice, a young black girl with ambition was often told, without words, to know her place. At Jefferson High, the lines were drawn in invisible ink. White students from Buckhead arrived in shiny Jeeps and designer sneakers. Black students from the South Side rode the bus, backpacks patched and frayed. Imani walked those halls with her head held high, but she felt the divide in every sideways glance and every whispered comment. Who does she think she is? She'll never make it out of here. Some days it was subtle, a teacher overlooking her raised hand in class. Other days it was sharp, a store clerk following her around the aisles pretending to tidy shelves. Each instance chipped away at something inside her, a steady erosion of confidence that she fought fiercely to hide. Still, she refused to shrink. When the world tried to make her invisible, she painted herself in bright colors. Her thrifted clothes were patched with bold fabrics and stitched with care. "If I can't buy fashion," she once told Caleb, "I'll create it." Every Friday after school, Imani would take the MARTA bus downtown, stepping off a few blocks from the glittering storefronts of Atlanta's luxury district. It was her ritual, part inspiration, part torture. She'd press her face against the cool glass of boutiques, like Maison Vert, and imagine the stories behind the clothes. This one's for the women who rule boardrooms, she'd whisper, sketching in her notebook. And this one, for the girl who refuses to apologize for taking up space. But it wasn't just about the clothes. It was about belonging. The world inside those stores, with its marble floors and hushed conversations, felt like a different planet. And Imani was determined to find a way in, even if she had to claw her way through the atmosphere. Still, reality had a way of pulling her back. Denise's medical bills were piling up, and her paycheck barely covered rent. College felt like a luxury they couldn't afford. When Imani talked about fashion school, Denise would smile gently and change the subject. "Baby, you're brilliant," she'd say, "but maybe think about something more stable." The Saturday she stood crying outside Maison Vert wasn't supposed to be special. Imani had saved for 3 months from her weekend job at a diner. Tips, stuffed into a jar under her bed, to buy a dress for the city's annual youth gala. It wasn't about vanity. It was about showing up and proving, if only to herself, that she belonged in those rooms. But the moment the doorman blocked her path, that hope crumbled. "Ma'am," he said again, his tone sharper this time, "this store is invite-only today." Imani glanced through the glass. A white girl about her age strolled in moments later. No invitation, no questions asked. The lie stung more than the words themselves. She felt the eyes of passers-by press against her like a weight. A mother tugged her daughter's hand and walked faster. 2 men in suits chuckled as they passed. And in that moment, all her years of hard work, all her dreams, all her carefully constructed confidence, they collapsed into the hot concrete beneath her feet. Across the street, seated on a bench, beneath the shade of an oak tree, Marvin Jacobs closed the newspaper he hadn't been reading. The 63-year-old billionaire founder of a global logistics company had seen 1,000 faces walk by that block. But this girl, standing outside a store with tears streaking down her cheeks and dignity clutched in trembling hands, caught his attention. Marvin had grown up on the South Side too. Back then, they called it the bottom, and he'd been the boy no one believed in. He knew the look in her eyes, not just humiliation, but defiance, the kind that refused to die. He rose slowly, leaning on his cane, and crossed the street. "Excuse me," he said gently. "Are you all right?" Imani blinked away tears, embarrassed to be seen. "I'm fine," she whispered, though the crack in her voice betrayed her. "No, you're not," Marvin said softly. "And you don't have to pretend." They sat together on that bench for nearly an hour. Imani told him about her dream of becoming a fashion designer, about her sketches and her savings jar, about the way people looked through her like she wasn't there. She spoke in halting sentences at first, then with a rush, as if a dam had broken. Marvin listened without interrupting. He remembered his own first rejection, a bank manager who'd laughed in his face when he asked for a loan to start his company. "You know," he said finally, "people like that doorman, they've already decided what box they think you belong in, but their box is too small for you." Imani managed a weak smile. "It doesn't feel like that right now." "It rarely does," he replied. "That's how you know you're about to grow beyond it." As the sun dipped below the skyline, Marvin pressed a business card into her hand. "Come see me Monday," he said. "I think I can help." That night, Imani lay awake staring at the ceiling, the card resting on her nightstand like a lifeline. Marvin Jacobs, CEO, Jacobs Global Freight. She'd Googled his name on the library computer once she got home. Billionaire, philanthropist, community investor. The idea that he'd even noticed her felt surreal, but hope was a dangerous thing. She'd learned that the hard way. What if it was just a polite gesture? What if he forgot all about her by Monday and... Yet, despite the doubt gnawing at her, she couldn't stop imagining what might happen if he didn't. The following days felt like walking a tightrope. At school, whispers followed her after someone posted a photo of her crying outside Maison Vert. "Luxury tears," one caption read. She really thought she belonged. Each comment hurt, but each one also steeled her resolve. She threw herself into her sketches, staying up late to perfect every line. She rehearsed what she might say if Marvin actually meant what he'd offered. And she practiced walking into a room like she deserved to be there. Denise noticed the change. "Something's different about you," she said one evening over dinner. "Maybe," Imani replied, hiding a small smile. "Maybe something's about to change." When Monday came, Imani stood outside the glass tower of Jacob's Global Freight, clutching her sketchbook like a shield. The lobby smelled of polished wood and money, the kind of place where even the silence felt expensive. The receptionist eyed her with a polite but practiced smile. "Do you have an appointment?" Mr. Jacobs told me to come," she stammered. A phone call later, an assistant appeared and led her upstairs. Marvin was waiting in a sunlit office overlooking the Atlanta skyline. "I'm glad you came," he said, motioning for her to sit. "Now tell me more about these designs." What began as a conversation turned into a mentorship. Marvin introduced her to designers, helped her enroll in weekend sewing classes, and even arranged an internship at a small boutique willing to take a chance on young talent. It wasn't easy. Some days she felt like an imposter, drowning in self-doubt. Others, she soared, like when one of her pieces was featured in a charity fashion show. Yet for every victory, there were setbacks. Snide comments from industry insiders, rejections from fashion schools, silent rooms that spoke volumes. But now, she wasn't fighting alone, and that made all the difference. As her confidence grew, so did the whispers, not just from her classmates, but from people inside the fashion world who didn't believe a girl like her deserved a seat at the table. And one powerful voice in a particular was determined to make sure she never got there. The battle for her dream was only beginning. The first time Imani stepped into the back room of Leona Hayes' atelier, the air smelled of musk, steam, and raw ambition. Bolts of fabric leaned against every wall, scissors clinked on cutting tables, and the hum of sewing machines created a rhythm that pulsed through the room like a heartbeat. It wasn't Paris or New York, but for Imani, it was the beginning of everything. Leona, a sharp-tongued, black designer in her 40s with a reputation for speaking truth louder than comfort, looked Imani up and down the day she arrived. "Marvin says you've got potential," she said, crossing her arms. "Potential is cheap. Discipline is rare. Which one are you?" Imani swallowed hard. "I'm both." Leona's eyebrow twitched, almost imperceptibly, and she handed Imani a pair of shears. "We'll see." Days turned into weeks. Imani's internship was unpaid and unforgiving. She steamed dresses, cleaned pins off the floor, and spent long hours adjusting hems until her fingers ached. But in the quiet moments, after everyone else had gone home, she practiced sketching silhouettes on the studio's drafting paper, refining every detail, chasing perfection. Sometimes Leona would glance over her shoulder and offer a gruff nod. Other times, silence, which Imani learned was its own kind of praise. Every bus ride home was a swirl of exhaustion and hope. She'd lean her head against the window and imagine her name stitched inside a garment tag, her designs walking down a runway, her mother and Caleb in the front row, cheering her on. But the deeper she waded into the fashion world, the more she saw its ugly undercurrent. At networking events and showroom launches, Imani noticed how eyes slid past her, how conversations shifted when she approached. One designer, drink in hand, mistook her for a coat check girl and handed over his jacket without a word. Another, a rising star from New York, leaned in close and whispered, "You're talented, but this industry has standards. People expect a certain presentation." The implication hung heavy in the air. Back at the studio, she vented to Leona. "They don't even see me," she said, pacing. "It's like I'm invisible until they need someone to serve drinks." Leona didn't sugarcoat. "That's how they keep the gate closed. They make you feel small so you won't knock harder. But what if they're right?" Imani's voice cracked. "What if someone like me doesn't belong here?" Leona slammed a measuring tape on the table. "Then why are you still here, Carter? People who don't belong quit. People who do keep showing up, even when the room tells them to leave." It was during one of those late-night bus rides that the idea took root. Imani stared out the window at the neon glow of downtown Atlanta and whispered to herself, "What if I build my own door?" The concept was wild, reckless even, but the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. If the fashion elite wouldn't give her a platform, she'd create one. Over the next few weeks, She poured every ounce of her energy into a plan. Step 1. Design a small capsule collection. 6 original pieces inspired by Black Southern heritage and contemporary style. Step 2. Host an independent fashion show. Not in a ballroom or a gallery, but somewhere real. A place where people like her belonged. Step 3. Invite press, designers, influencers, and community leaders. Make them see her. It was ambitious, bordering on impossible, but impossible had never stopped her before. Imani's bedroom transformed into a makeshift studio. Fabric scraps covered the floor, and sewing patterns lined the walls like constellations. She spent every spare hour designing, cutting, and stitching. Caleb became her unofficial assistant, holding fabrics and critiquing color choices with the blunt honesty only a younger brother could provide. "This one's fire," he'd say. "But that one looks like a church curtain." Marvin, ever the mentor, offered to fund the venue and materials. But Imani refused. "If I do this," she said, "I need to know I earned it." Instead, he connected her with a network of local business owners, a caterer who offered discounted services, a DJ willing to work for free publicity, and a small printing company that donated flyers. Piece by piece, the impossible became achievable. But word of her plan began to spread, and not everyone was supportive. At a high-profile fashion mixer one evening, Imani overheard 2 designers whispering near the bar. "Did you hear about that intern planning her own show? Yeah, it's cute, but she's going to embarrass herself." Some people don't understand there's a reason the system works the way it does. The words burned. Part of her wanted to shrink, to abandon the plan before it imploded. But another part, the part that remembered the doorman's sneer and the laughter on the sidewalk, grew sharper, stronger. She wasn't just doing this for herself anymore. She was doing it for every girl who'd ever been told she didn't belong. 2 weeks before the show, disaster struck. The community center where she planned to host the event backed out, citing scheduling conflicts. Imani suspected pressure from local sponsors who didn't want their names associated with an amateur showcase. Panic clawed at her chest. She called venue after venue, but most were either too expensive or already booked. The dream she had stitched together was unraveling before her eyes. One night, after another round of rejection calls, she collapsed onto her bed, tears soaking her pillow. "Maybe they were right," she whispered into the darkness. "Maybe I'm just playing dress up." Caleb sat beside her, silent for a long time before speaking. "You remember what you told me when I failed that science test?" She sniffed. "What? You said failure isn't the end. It's just proof that you're trying something hard enough to matter." Imani laughed through the tears. "Did I really say that?" "Yeah," he said. "Now prove you meant it." Fueled by stubbornness and desperation, Imani decided to take one last risk. She reached out to the Underground, a historic marketplace turned cultural event space in downtown Atlanta. The rent was still too high. But she wrote a heartfelt letter about her mission, her story, and the show's message. A week later, she received an email. "We believe in what you're doing. Let's make it happen." The date was set. The venue was hers. The final weeks were a blur of chaos and caffeine. Volunteers from her school helped sew garments and distribute flyers. Local musicians offered to perform. Even Leona, who had maintained a stoic distance, dropped by one afternoon with a box of leftover fabric. "Don't waste it," she said, pretending not to care. "I hate wasted fabric." Despite the mounting excitement, doubt still crept in at night. Would anyone show up? Would the press even care? What if the clothes looked amateurish under the bright lights? But each time the fear threatened to overwhelm her, she remembered the moment outside Maison Vert, the humiliation, the tears, and used it as fuel. She was not that girl anymore. 3 days before the show, an envelope arrived at the atelier. It bore the elegant gold crest of Maison Vert. Imani's hands trembled as she tore it open. Inside was a brief, curt message. "We have been made aware of your planned event. Please be advised that unauthorized use of our name, designs, or associated imagery will result in immediate legal action. Additionally, any defamatory remarks about our brand will not be tolerated." Her chest tightened. They knew, they were watching, and they were trying to shut her down before she even began. Leona scanned the letter and scoffed. "Classic intimidation. Means you're starting to scare them." "But what if they do sue?" Imani whispered. "I don't have the money to fight that." Then don't mention them, Leona said. You don't need their name to prove your worth. Still, the threat hung over her like a storm cloud, and as the day of the show approached, one question echoed louder than the rest. Would this be the moment that launched her dream, or the one that destroyed it before it ever began? The night before the show, as volunteers set up lights and models rehearsed their walks, Imani stood alone on the stage, staring out at the empty seats. Somewhere out there, influential people were rooting for her to fail. Somewhere out there, the same system that once locked her out of a store was now trying to lock her out of an industry. But for the first time in her life, she didn't feel small. She felt ready, and when those doors opened, the world would never ignore her again. The night of the show arrived draped in tension. A crisp October breeze swept through downtown Atlanta, rattling the neon signs and carrying the hum of the city through the narrow alleys near the underground. Inside, Imani stood backstage, hands trembling against the fabric of her first design. A flowing, floor-length gown inspired by the red Georgia clay and the resilience of black women who had walked that soil for generations. Her heart pounded like a drum. Every doubt, every insult, every whispered she doesn't belong seemed to rise to the surface at once. But she pushed it down, straightened her back, and whispered to herself, "You've already survived worse than this." The first guests began to arrive, just after 6 p.m. At first, it was familiar faces, classmates, neighbors, a handful of teachers. But then came more. Reporters from local magazines, boutique owners, a representative from an Atlanta lifestyle channel, even a few buyers from regional fashion houses. Word had spread farther than she dared to hope. Backstage, the models, friends, classmates, and community volunteers buzzed with nervous energy. Caleb ran around with a clipboard, barking instructions like a seasoned show producer. 5 minutes to curtain, he shouted. Imani peeked through a gap in the curtain and felt her breath catch. The room was packed, every seat. Standing room too. Somewhere in the third row she spotted Marvin, his hands folded calmly in his lap, a proud smile playing at the corners of his lips. And then, her heart skipped. Front row, center, the Maison Vert creative director, and beside her, 2 executives she recognized from industry events, the same ones who'd laughed at the idea of an intern hosting a show. They weren't here to support her. They were here to watch her fail. The lights dimmed. A hush fell over the crowd. The opening chords of a jazz quartet swelled through the space as the first model stepped onto the runway. It wasn't a polished, Paris-ready production. The lighting was slightly uneven, and the backdrop was handmade. But the clothes told a story. Bold prints blended with structured tailoring. Traditional African motifs merged with modern silhouettes. Every piece was a statement. We are here. We are powerful. We are worthy. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the second look emerged. A fitted blazer with intricate hand-stitched beadwork, followed by a flowing gown that seemed to capture the movement of fire itself. Backstage, Imani paced like a caged lion. Each round of applause landed like a heartbeat in her chest. The louder the room grew, the stronger she felt. But halfway through the show, disaster struck. The lights flickered, once, twice, and then cut out completely. Darkness swallowed the room. Murmurs turned to confusion. Imani's stomach dropped. "Backup generator," Caleb shouted. "It's not responding," someone yelled from the tech booth. Panic surged. Was this an accident? Or sabotage? She didn't have time to wonder. People were already pulling out their phones. The glow of dozens of screens illuminating the space in a ghostly light. Imani forced herself to breathe. "This is your moment. Don't let them take it. Keep walking," she whispered to the models. "Use the phone lights. We finish this show, no matter what." And they did. One by one, they walked through the dim light, the audience holding their breath. The darkness transformed the show into something raw and intimate, like a secret being shared. By the time the lights finally sputtered back on, the audience erupted into applause, a standing ovation. After the final model took her walk, Imani stepped onto the stage, microphone in hand. Her palms were sweaty, but her voice, steady and strong, cut through the room. "Some people told me this night would never happen," she began. "They said girls like me don't belong on runways, that we don't have the pedigree, the background, the look. But here's the truth. Belonging isn't something you're given. It's something you claim." The crowd roared. "And this," she gestured to the models lined up behind her, is us claiming it. As the applause swelled, the Maison Vert creative director rose from her seat and approached the stage. The room fell silent. "You've made quite the impression," she said, voice calm and measured. "We'd like to talk about opportunities. Perhaps a collaboration, an apprenticeship. There's potential here." The offer hung in the air like bait on a hook. It was everything Imani had once dreamed of. A ticket into the world that had slammed its doors in her face. But something in her had changed. "Thank you," she said slowly. "But I'm not here to ask for a seat at your table." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. "I'm building my own." The room exploded in cheers. As the celebration carried on, Marvin walked onto the stage beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You kept your promise," he said, pride shining in his eyes. "And now I'll keep mine." Confused, Imani turned to him. "What promise?" He stepped to the microphone. 6 months ago, I met a young woman on a sidewalk outside a luxury store. I saw fire in her eyes, the kind that changes industries. Tonight, I'm announcing the launch of the Carter Jacobs Fashion Incubator, a new initiative to fund and mentor underrepresented designers. And I'm proud to say its first creative director is standing right here. The room erupted again, louder this time, a wave of applause and whistles that seemed to shake the walls. Reporters surged forward, flashbulbs popped, and tears streamed down Imani's face as she covered her mouth in disbelief. The same girl who had once been told, "Not today," now stood at the center of a movement that would open doors for countless others. Backstage, the chaos was electric. Cameras crowded around, business cards piled into her hands, and messages from major publications flooded her phone. But amid the whirlwind, one image burned brightest in her mind. Herself, standing outside Maison Vert, tears streaming down her face. She wished she could reach back through time and whisper to that girl, "Hold on, everything's about to change," because it had. Not just for her, but for every young designer who had ever been told they weren't enough. As the crowd dispersed and the lights dimmed, Imani stood alone on the stage, staring out into the empty seats. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time, she wasn't chasing approval. She was shaping the future, and the industry had no choice but to pay attention. The morning after the show felt unreal. Atlanta's fashion press was ablaze with headlines. Teen designer redefines Southern style. Imani Carter's underground show lights a fire under the industry. From rejection to revolution, a star is born. Imani sat at the kitchen table in her family's apartment, a mug of coffee growing cold in her hands, staring at the articles on her laptop. Caleb burst through the door, waving the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. "Page 1, he shouted. "Page 1! She laughed, a deep, breathless laugh that felt like release. For the first time, the world wasn't laughing at her. They were listening. By noon, her voicemail was full. Boutique owners wanted to carry her designs. Local TV stations requested interviews. A prominent fashion school in New York offered her a full scholarship. Even a representative from a major department store chain asked to meet. The same industry that had once ignored her now scrambled to attach its name to hers. But amid the whirlwind of opportunity, the most satisfying call came from Maison Vert's corporate office. The same executive who once dismissed her with a condescending email now spoke with careful politeness. "We'd like to offer you a position as a junior designer," he said. "Your perspective is unique." Imani didn't hesitate. "Thank you," she said. "But I'm already building something that doesn't require your permission." The silence on the other end was delicious. Behind the scenes, the fallout from Maison Vert was swift. Social media had seized on the story of the girl once turned away at their door. And the optics weren't good. Hashtags like Norleatherin and Mar Carter effect trended for days. Protesters staged small demonstrations outside their Atlanta store, holding signs that read, "Fashion is for everyone," and "Talent has no dress code." The company issued a carefully worded public apology. Too late, too corporate, too hollow. Their attempt to sign Imani as a diversity hire was widely mocked, and while their sales recovered, their reputation never fully did. Imani didn't rejoice in their stumble. She didn't need to. Their downfall was simply proof that the world was changing, and that they had refused to change with it. Within months, the Carter Jacobs Fashion Incubator became more than just a mentorship program. It evolved into a platform, one that spotlighted marginalized designers, hosted free workshops, and partnered with historically black colleges and universities to create pipelines into the fashion industry. Imani, now its creative director, traveled across the country speaking to young creatives who saw themselves in her story. At every event, she repeated the same message. Your worth is not measured by who lets you in. It's measured by what you build when they shut you out. The message resonated deeply. Designers from underrepresented backgrounds began forming collectives, launching pop-up shows, and demanding equity in spaces that had long excluded them. What started as one girl's fight to be seen had ignited a cultural shift. 6 months later, Imani found herself back on Peachtree Street, the same block where she'd once stood humiliated and tear-streaked. Maison Vert's storefront looked unchanged. Same gleaming glass, same mannequin displays. But the girl staring back in the reflection was not the same. She wasn't just a dreamer anymore. She was a designer, a leader, a voice that could no longer be ignored. Marvin joined her on the sidewalk, hands clasped behind his back. Feels different now, doesn't it? Yeah, she said, smiling. It's strange. I used to think getting in there was the goal. But it never was. Marvin raised an eyebrow. Then what was? Building something bigger, something no one could lock me out of. Later that evening, at a small celebration with her family and friends, Denise pulled her aside. Tears shimmered in her mother's eyes. You remember the night you told me about your dream? Denise said softly. I was so scared. Scared you'd get hurt. Scared the world would break you. But it didn't. You bent it. Imani swallowed hard, emotion catching in her throat. I didn't do it alone. No, Denise smiled. But you started it. And that's what matters. As the room filled with laughter, music, and hope, Imani felt a deep, grounding sense of peace. The humiliation, the rejection, the nights she almost gave up, they had all led here. She wasn't just designing clothes, she was designing a possibility. In the months that followed, stories like Imani's became less rare. A Latina designer in Chicago launched her own brand. A group of Native American artists formed a collective that redefined traditional fashion. A Muslim woman in Detroit created a line that fused modest wear with high fashion and sold out in days. Each of them cited Imani as their inspiration. Each of them stood on the foundation she had built, but success wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning of a larger fight, because even as doors opened, new barriers emerged, and Imani knew the next generation would need someone to keep pushing them down, and she was ready. The story of Imani Carter isn't just about fashion. It's about something more profound, something woven into the fabric of every person who's ever been told they don't belong. It's about how injustice can humiliate you, break you, and try to erase you. But it's also about how resilience can rebuild you into something unshakable. Imani never got the apology she deserved from Maison Vert, but in the end, she didn't need it. Because the greatest revenge against a world that tries to silence. You's not screaming louder, it's building something, so powerful that it can't ignore you anymore. Every stitch she sewed was an act of defiance, every design is a statement of identity, and every step she took away from that luxury storefront was a step toward rewriting the rules, not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever been left on the outside looking in. And here's the truth, this isn't just her story. It's ours. Racism, classism, exclusion, they don't vanish overnight. They evolve. They adapt. But so do we. So ask yourself this. What if it were you standing outside that door? Would you walk away? Or would you build something so undeniable that the world had no choice but to open it for you? Or better yet, to follow you through? If Imani's story moved you, share it. Talk about it. And more importantly, look around. At your school, your workplace, your neighborhood, and ask, who's being left out here? Because sometimes the most potent change doesn't happen inside the room. It happens when someone outside decides to build a new one, and maybe that someone is you.